Hey there, hi there, greetings and all that. We arrive home, right, through our travel log, our world regional travel log. We arrive home this week. We're at the end. Can't take you guys any farther. We're at the end of the home stretch today, and we are in another region that is changing rapidly, right? For boomers like myself, it's becoming barely recognizable in some ways. I'd say since Mr. Bush left office in 2009, much has accelerated in regard to that change, but it's probably a topic for maybe even another course. Today, of course, we look at the United States, Canada, and Greenland. Yes, Greenland. It's considered a part of North America. And when I come to this chapter, I do not know how to approach it until I get there. Um, Sometimes I split it up if there are enough weeks in the semester that allow me to do that. But I do like to send enough love to our neighbors to the north, Canada. If for nothing else, I once constructed the outlines of a Canadian history course that no college was interested in, including in their social studies courses. But yeah, I did a lot of research on the country and still do. I still follow along the current events up there. So there's a vested interest bias here, right, with the instructor. So we certainly include that. But yeah, if the semester allows, I will do a week of North America and a week of Canada, but we don't have that time. That just only have a certain amount of weeks this year, so or this semester, and so we'll include them together. So let's look ahead at what we're going to be covering today, and get that up here, and boom, there we go. Chapter 12, North America. Some of the major heads up terms. First Nations. When we talk about the First Nations, we're basically talking about the natives, right? The natives, Native Americans, but considered the First Nations in Canada. The Quebec Act, British granted limited rights to the French and some territory, which is today the province of Quebec, after the British defeated the French in the French and Indian War here in North America. The BNA, the British North American Act, 1867. It was getting expensive for the British to maintain Canada, and basically the Canadians received their independence there. The UN Security Council, I'll mention them. Basically, multi-national institution, right, out of the UN to maintain international peace and security. The Northeast Corridor. The Northeast Corridor extends from Boston down to Washington, D.C., or otherwise known as the megalopolis. We'll develop that. Francophones. These are French-speaking Canadians, overwhelmingly in Quebec. Appalachia, interesting enough. People look at Appalachia when they think of it, and they think, the poor South, and it does include that. But the Appalachians, for all intents and purposes, extend from the southern tier of New York State to northern Alabama and Georgia. We are in Appalachia here in western Pennsylvania. Many of you are, I guess all of you guys that are going to be looking at this as students at Mount Aloysius are, right now residing in Appalachia, right? Nunavut. Nunavut. That's his means our land. It's the latest province, territory of Canada to the Inuit Indians. It was given to them land claims through the Land Claims Agreement Act, 1999, right? Fairly recent. The Inuit Indians predominantly populate that particular area. So today we want to recognize the world roles of the United States and Canada. We want to examine the subregions of both. We want to become aware of Canada's emergence. Just kind of simulate the various ethnic tensions experienced by the average Canadian. That will be done through your discussion question, which you guys will see on our course page. And so, yeah, kind of not into this one here. See, like I said, we just kind of sometimes change things right on the fly. There you go. Okay, here we go. The United States of America and Canada, I'm just setting the notes up here. The United States and Canada are two of the largest countries in the world. Canada ranks second, in land mass, the United States fourth. The United States is the world's third most populous country, but it's considerably smaller than China and India, right? We looked at those earlier and talked about that. Both Canada and the United States are predominantly urban, highly productive, and very affluent, very affluent. A settlement of the region by Native Americans and First Nations in Canada began thousands of years ago. Contemporary North America has been profoundly influenced, however, by Europeans who settled between 1500 and 1900. Settlement patterns. Canadian changes were slower than those in the United States. The French were the first settlers. The British loyalists were either forced out or they voluntarily emigrated to the Atlantic provinces or the northwest shores of Lake Ontario, Toronto area as well. Hostility from the French dictated these settlement patterns. So Canada, how's it emerged? The 7 Years' War. 7 Years' War. The French and the British, your European powers, were vying for power all around the globe, the balance of power, right, or all around the globe. And that was considered the 7 Years' War. Here in North America, known as the French and Indian War. The British, of course, as we know, they're victorious over the French. The Quebec Act. The Quebec Act is, the Quebec Act, to explain that, that extends Quebec's territory and grants limited rights to the French. British North Americans want more independence. Again, mercantilism, we looked at that earlier in the course, was getting very expensive for the British. And British-American relations were getting strained. So, these types of things caused the British to give British North America its independence. So the nation gained increased responsibility in 1867 as it became its own dominion with the British North America Act, or the BNA. Therefore, an independent Canada is born. Now, Canada's original pre-European inhabitants, known as the First Nations, that migration pattern would be similar, up to similar scrutiny, if you will, as that of the U.S. Native American population. You turn now to pages 522 and 524. I want to look at North America's vast and diverse resource base. And along with that, we have a couple of maps I want you to see. Some natural resource maps on page 522 and page 524, climate and some biome maps and land use maps. Okay. And I'm going to set this section up here with just a little introductory section here. You can take a look at those maps as I do that. So North America has a vast and diverse resource base, which has enabled it and Canada to develop the world's leading agricultural and manufacturing sectors. Nearly all of the world's climates are found in North America, with the majority of the region dominated by the mid-Atlantic climates. The western third of Canada and the United States is mountainous, with some active volcanoes in the Cascades and southwestern Alaska. The Canadian Shield, you can see that over on, I'll have you drop back actually to the map on page, kind of the overview map, right, that I like of the regions. Map 512. Yeah, you could probably keep a finger in there, a bookmark too, figure maps 512 and 513. And on 512, you can see the Canadian Shield. That encompasses a lot of Canada proper, right? Kind of uninhabitable. But so you have the Canadian Shield and the interior lowlands that dominate between the Cascades and southwestern Alaska, and the Rocky Mountain. You have the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains, which extend from northern Georgia into the Atlantic provinces of Canada. Okay, so the major river systems and the Great Lakes, they also play an important role in in the defining both the physical and human geographies of the region. Got the Mississippi, Missouri, Ohio systems that not only drain nearly 1/3 of the continent, but it also has served an important transportation network, right, for the movement of goods and people. So, the region experiences a wide range, too, of natural hazards, including hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, volcanoes, and floods. I think the United States experiences the most tornadoes of anyone on the globe, as a matter of fact. So the vast resources that come about, right? This particular section here, let's knock that down here. Vast resources. Canada and the United States are two of the world's wealthier countries. Both are rich in natural resources. Both have large land masses and populations. That were industrialized rather early. So each country has experienced peace and safety at home, encouraging investment and economic growth, with that peace and safety. The United States and Canada have a history of political stability and national unity. Both countries have large deposits of fossil fuels. Alternative methods from wind and solar power have gained popularity as well. But so has the usage of oil availability from Canadian tar sands. And on page 548, figure 1150, I have a overhead shot there of some surface mining of tar sands near Fort McMurray, Alberta. You can take a look at that and look at the caption. So the U.S. was considered energy independent in 2019 through fracking and drilling for oil in the continental United States. So therefore, importing much less oil from abroad. Under the Biden administration, domestic oil drilling has pretty much stopped, and foreign oil importation has returned due to primarily environmental concerns. So beginning in the summer of 2021, oil and gas prices began climbing, coupled with extensive government spending. The U.S. has currently had experienced. I think prices are coming down. Employment is rising again. Oil and gas prices are coming down, still a lot higher than where they were 2020. We had experienced maybe our worst recession in 40 years. COVID-19 flared up in North America in early 2020 and broke in on economies that were doing well, actually. The cases and deaths initially were alarming, but in the U.S., they were mitigated via rapid development. Take a look at world roles of the U.S. and Canada, the United States, and the United Nations. The UN Security Council is the most powerful branch of the UN. Its purpose is to maintain international peace and security. 5 countries are granted seats: the United States, France, China, the United Kingdom, and Russia. And one of the things they'll do is authorize sanctions, or a couple of things, authorize sanctions and military action. So a lot of power. Global role of the regional economy. After the 1991 breakup of the Soviet Union, the U.S. remained the sole superpower. So the U.S. is the preeminent military and economic power. Someone would argue maybe China is also entered into that orbit. So in light of its penchant for isolationism, its influence on world affairs in large due to 2 world wars in the 20th century. So after the 1991 breakup of the Soviet Union, the United States remained, as I said, the sole superpower. The terror attacks on 9/11/01 changed America's foreign policy from a Cold War posture to a preemptive policy where you go in and you take care of things before they erupt, right? And this was emblemized by the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq. Under President Obama, the U.S. was observed as reticent. Some said, kind of, quote, leading from behind. Under President Trump, forfeiting global involvement. Then the Biden administration appears to be turning back to the track taken by the Obama administration, strengthening transatlantic relationships with Europe and a commitment to NATO and collective security. Biden has also returned to the Paris Climate Agreement and other aggressive measures to combat, so-called man-made climate change. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Act, was established in 1988 between the United States and Canada. Mexico was added in 1994. NAFTA was succeeded by the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, otherwise known as the USMCA, in 2020. That was a marking up of NAFTA by Trump and his administration. Although it ushered in a boom to trade between the three countries, it also brought on a exodus of jobs out of the Canadian Southeast and America's Northeast, industrial Northeast, to jobs into Mexico. So U.S. immigration policy too has been erratic. We'll get to as we look at the population patterns as a result of this. Population change and natural growth. U.S. population increases are basically due in large part to young immigrant communities. And this is different from other wealthy and technologically advanced countries because these families have larger families and higher birth rates. So what's the population distribution like? Well, it's been increasing urban density, right? The Northeast Corridor, or the Eastern Seaboard from Washington, D.C. down to Boston, or up to Boston. Patterns of migration in the United States, the latter half of the 1800s, the higher number of immigrants were coming from Southern Europe, primarily Italy. Immigrant groups often maintain a younger age for the working population and higher birth rates. Immigrants respond more, actually, surprising to a lot of folks, respond more to the U.S. economy than they do to laws. Than they actually do to laws. So, a majority of immigrants to the U.S. come from Latin America, especially Mexico. Again, like I was alluding to, U.S. immigration policy has been erratic. Much of that has to do with, your politicians in Washington. You have, the Democrats favor a pathway to citizenship for what we call dreamers, right? Born to unauthorized immigrants, whereas Republicans largely oppose that policy. So in recent years, there's been a growing debate on the efficiency of whether a strong border wall or technology to keep out unauthorized immigration from Mexico into the U.S. Ever since 2006, up through the Trump administration, the number of the successful unauthorized entries into the U.S. Was dropping. That has been climbing since the Biden administration took office. Contemporary immigration patterns in the United States. We have 330 million people in the United States. Most of that is of European descent. About 13% is African American, and maybe 18 to 19% is Hispanic. Okay, so kind of doing the math there, between, 68 and maybe, roughly 68, 75% of North America is, Caucasian, European descent. Then you have Native Americans. Right? Native Americans, most important source of income there has been casino gambling, which is designed to encourage relations with the wider economy. The just kind of FYI on that. The original pre-European inhabitants, known as Native Americans in the U.S., is Indians, right? Migration patterns are under debate, as are the dates of their arrival. Some indigenous groups developed livelihoods based on agriculture and settled dwellings. However, most were nomadic and dependent on hunting and gathering. Distinguished linguistic and cultural diversity existed between the 10 indigenous groups. All were fairly well adapted to local environments, but arguably greatly disrupted by European contact. Native Americans are among the poorest culture group in the U.S. Those that did look to assimilate with American culture are some of the wealthiest subgroups. Some of those groups have more millionaires per capita than any people group in the world. So you can think about that and formulate your own opinion on that. But yeah, so you have that issue, a smaller issue in the on the front burners of the, or maybe on the back burner of the American media as some other issues. Kind of similar to that as Canada and the well, we'll get to that. I want to look at juxtapose now Canada and the United Nations. We'll get into the First Nations and the Canadian government. Canada and the United Nations. I guess I want to say this too before we leave the U.S. and their migration patterns. The majority of African Americans in the United States, I want to say this, the majority of African Americans live in the Southeast United States, probably about 55%, right, of the African American population are in that region. Canada and the United Nations. The Canadian military, don't hear too much about the Canadian military. They are known for taking leads in peacekeeping missions. Probably the most famous work they did there was in the ethnic cleansing in Rwanda back in the mid 1990s. Population distribution in Canada. The vast majority of Canadians are found in a belt across the southern part of the country, nearly parallel to the border of the United States, going north to south, a 100-mile range, right? Thus, there's high population density in those areas. Canadian patterns of ethnic integration. Large urban centers found in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. They attract numerous amounts of immigrants. Canadian government sets up policies that do not segregate by discrimination. Centrifugal forces. We talk about that. We're talking about areas of friction, okay? So you have a couple big ones there. The challenge of Quebec and the rights of the First Nations. Francophones are French-speaking Canadians. Majority of those are in Quebec. French-speaking Canadian, they have a strong sense of being a separate nation within a larger Canadian political framework. So what are they afraid of? Well, they're afraid of losing their culture. They're afraid of losing their culture and a language as well. And they've unified there with a major political party in Canada called the PQ, short for the Parti Québécois. It's a separatist political party whose purpose is to achieve Quebec's independence. So every so many years, there is a census in Canada, and with that census, there is a poll taken in Quebec about separation. And if it ever gets over 50%, then in Quebec, then the province can separate. And it was in the 1990s, the capital, Ottawa, had a real scare because it was they polled at 49.5%. So as a result, to placate Quebec and keep them in Canada, their English-speaking Canadians are sometimes a little worked up at laws they see that are being crafted that favor Quebec or give them extra attention. Several groups within that province do not share the same goal, though. The reason are they're English speaking. Some are business owners who fear the loss of business, and recent immigrants who wish to reside in Canada. And if you take a look at a map of Canada and just envision Quebec not being there, that would be problematic too, because the Atlantic provinces who need the most welfare, they would be separated from Ottawa and the rest of Canada. So yeah, it's problematic for Ottawa to entertain the thought of a separated Quebec. Now, there's not as much violence, between the inhabitants of the First Nations and Europeans in Canada as there was between Native Americans and Europeans in the U.S., but there were problems. European diseases obliterated the indigenous peoples. The governments and the government in Canada kind of went back on its word with the indigenous peoples to provide food and land. And this was a decision that caused thousands to die of starvation. In 1885, the Plains tribes in Saskatchewan mutinied against Canadian rule. So eventually, indigenous peoples in Canada ended up on reservations too. And it was not out of the ordinary neglect and illness. First Nations peoples gained citizenship rights in 1956, followed in 1960 with the right to vote. The federal government in Ottawa made an official apology in 1998 for its past treatment of the indigenous peoples and have been granting them land and financial reparations ever since. In 1999, 1/5 of Canada's total land mass was ceded over to the Inuit tribe, who named the territory Nunavut, which means our land. And again, page 560, figure 1160, you could see that land right just east of the Northwest Territories. Let's take a look at regions of the United States as we start to hit the home stretch here. And you can turn to page 564 and look at a map of the United States as I go through the breakdown of let me see if I just want to make sure here. I think we're good to go there. 564. 564. Yes. Yep, that's going to work. So the regions of the United States. You have New England, right? New England will be at the starting from the northeast and making our way west. New England, made up of the 5 states of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Then you have the megalopolis, the Northeast Corridor, right? That kind of bleeds into New England, right? Along the coastline, Boston down to Washington, D.C. That's pretty much the media and financial capital of the country. And then you have Appalachia, right? East Kentucky, West Virginia, Western Virginia, Eastern Tennessee, and Central Appalachia. And this is one of the poorest areas in the United States. Coal mining is still very important, but it's kind of spotty. Okay. The manufacturing belt, right? The manufacturing belt, we're kind of looking there from roughly, Buffalo, Pittsburgh on over to Chicago, right? Your auto industry in Detroit would be maybe the emblemize that, right? And then you got the U.S. heartland, Midwest and Great Plains. The term quote unquote Midwest is applied to the 8 states of the Corn Belt and the Great Lakes area. Rural areas, then you got the South, right? Rural areas remain the poorest to the South. Your Mississippi Delta region. Okay. Major cotton producers up to the mid-1900s. The upper Mississippi River Valley from Louisiana and Mississippi through Arkansas and southeastern Missouri. Then you have your Western Rocky Mountains, Western Rockies, right, from, your Rocky Mountain states. And then Southwest, the southwest part of the country from West Texas on over into San Diego. Some geographers will include Texas in with the southern South, but most do not. Southwest, pretty much Texas, the whole state on over into Southern California. Pacific Coast from Puget Sound, Washington, down to San Diego. That's become a second national cone economically, culturally. I think California could be considered the 8th largest economy in the world. Sometimes considered, from San Francisco Bay Area. San Francisco Bay Area, home to Silicon Valley, has probably the highest cost of living, but a lot of people are leaving that area too. High crime is becoming outrageous in San Francisco, right? Causing some corporations to leave. And then Alaska and Hawaii. Alaska and Hawaii has it's considered its own region. Alaska, the largest U.S. state, stretching from the Arctic Circle. If you fit its entire size in the continental 48, you would see that it would stretch from Florida, Georgia line, north as far as Minnesota, Manitoba. The eastern border would straddle the Illinois-Indiana border, across to on a line westward in the Plain States, southwest through northern Texas, down through southwest and up the coast up to about Bakersfield, California. In fact, your authors, you want to look at that visually. Turn to figure 514, figure 11.3. It's just amazing how big Alaska is when you look at that. And also, there are ongoing contentions about whether there needs to be drilling at the oil reserves in Alaska, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, ANWR. The argument there is, you're going to be exploiting the area. Pages 574 and 575 has an inset map of that particular area. And over on page 575, the controversial Trans-Alaska Pipeline, right, that delivers, a lot of oil out of it. And again, the argument there, it can make, do you risk exploiting wildlife, or do you take the chances there at the expense of becoming dependent on other areas of the world with oil and natural gas. Regions of Canada. Regions of Canada. You have page 570 or 564. Canadian provinces were created 100 years after the United States, but actually have the greater internal political control. We have the policy of federalism here in the United States, equal balance of power between the states and the federal government. Actually, in Canada, the provinces have a lot more freedom and leeway from Ottawa than our states do from Washington, D.C. Going from east to west, you have the Atlantic provinces, principal recipients of federal aid. Fishing can be contingent on available stocks. And then you have Quebec, right, settled shortly after the French settlement, right? Kind of a distinct society there, you could say. They developed long lot settlements designed to maximize land ownership along the St. Lawrence River. Then there's Ontario, your political and economic nerve center, arguably, in Canada. It was the center of British control. Toronto, Canada's biggest city. Provinces, the political center of the country. Capitals in Ottawa. And then you have your prairie provinces, right? Your prairie provinces of Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba. A lot of folk and people in Alberta would argue that is the economic nerve center, because that's where a lot of the oil and natural gas is, right? And a lot of folk in Alberta feel they're much chagrined about the oil money traveling east, to, placate Quebec, pay for the bureaucracies in Ottawa and Ontario, and to pay for the welfare state. That's often the case out in the Atlantic provinces. There's been a small secession group in Alberta that talks about leaving Canada, and some of that group like to join the United States. Then you have your West Coast, right? Your West Coast and British Columbia, up through the Yukon and Northwest Territories, right? Along with Northern Canada, with Nunavut, we mentioned those earlier, came about in 1999. But a lot of that area there, up there, is also barren rock, too. You really cannot do a whole lot with it. And then lastly, we want to give Greenland, right, a little love here before we leave. And you can see that on your map as well. Although Greenland is a property of Denmark, it is geologically a part of North America. Okay, Greenland is the world's largest island, has 56,000 inhabitants. Since it is the property of Denmark, the Danish government controls the island and its foreign affairs. Greenland is it's also significant for its mineral resources and proximity between the rivals, United States and Russia. Okay. And there you have it, taking you as far as I can go with the information section of the course. Let's take a look at the graphic organizer, wrap it up, and then talk about what's up ahead. And you guys know what is up ahead. I'm going to go through it in case I randomly come across something I forgot. Yeah, North America, the regions, vast resources and all that, the regions, provinces in Canada, a lot of political control for the Canadian provinces. You have the Atlantic provinces, Quebec, Ontario. Quebec's a UN leader in peacekeeping, or Canada is. You got your prairie provinces, the West Coast provinces, and northern Canada, including Nunavut. Political forces, you got Quebec and the First Nations. Quebec, you got the Francophones and the PQ, the Parti Québécois, right? They make a lot of noise from time to time. The First Nations, a lot of land claims by the First Nations that haven't been acknowledged by Ottawa, right? And that needs to be taken care of, right? French and British loyalists. You had the French and Indian War, the Quebec Act after the British defeat the French, kind of carving up territory for French speakers, the French culture. The whole thing was getting very expensive for the British back home, and they give the Canadians their independence, the British North America Act in 1867. Vast resources in North America, right? Large deposits of fossil fuels, two of the wealthier countries as a result of the vast natural resources. We have a history of peace and stability. And there's also a lot of interest in alternative methods of energy. Population patterns here in the United States, large influx of Hispanics, 15 to 20% of the country. Both the United States and Canada are urban. They got the Northeast Corridor here in the United States. Casino gambling and government handouts to encourage interaction with the wider economy of Native Americans. United States big-time world roles in the UN Security Council, Canada as well. Offering sanctions and military action when need be. And then the regions here in the United States, right? Northeast Corridor, you got New England, Northeast Corridor, of course, the megalopolis from Boston down to Washington, D.C. You got the manufacturing belt from roughly Pittsburgh, Buffalo over to Chicago area, the heartland and Midwest, the South, your Western mountains and the Rockies, or Southwest, Pacific Coast, another big economic cultural hub, and Alaska and Hawaii. And what is up ahead? Tuesday, the 12th. Tuesday, the 12th, 12:01, your final will be available. It'll be a 90-minute final. Just like the quizzes, you'll be able to take that up to 11:59 on the 12th. Any makeups would have to be done on the 16th. And your item sheets, I mentioned that on an earlier announcement, the item sheets, I was remiss in mentioning that to you folks via the lectures, but you know, your item sheets are on, you can get those on the chapter 10. If you go back to chapter 10, if you didn't see the announcement, you can go back to chapter 10 page module on our course page and be able to see what the item sheets are that are on the final. You'll have several options of essay questions that you can bone up on and look like a genius to me after you bone up on those. And so there you have it. Yeah, certainly, as I always say, do well, right? Do well, take advantage of those item sheets, and I look forward to a lot of A's and a lot of grades, right, that are going to be able to transfer, right? Transfer or, you know, be able to get you guys to the next levels. So you guys know where to find me if you have questions, comments, or concerns, right? Have a fantastic week. Bye-bye.